Good morning, and welcome to our conversation on race, extremism, and accountability after the Capitol siege. I'm Paul Butler, and I'm joined by my colleague, Mary McCord. Mary, good morning. Can you
Good
please,
morning, Paul.
can you please introduce yourself and talk about your work at Georgetown?
Sure, thank you. And thanks to Georgetown Law for hosting today's event. So for those who don't know me, I am a visiting professor at Georgetown, and I am the legal director of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. We are a small constitutional impact litigation, really law firm within the law school. We have a practicum every semester where we involve students in our work, and we litigate across a broad range of constitutional issues, from criminal justice reform, immigration, First Amendment, separation of powers, and interestingly, and particularly pertinent, I think, to today's conversation, we have litigated against unlawful private militias and paramilitary organizations, including many of those who were involved in the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally back in August of 2017. We used state anti-militia laws in order to bring a case for forward-looking relief, prohibiting those groups, those were white supremacist groups, as well as unlawful private militias, bringing a case to prohibit them from engaging in that type of organized, coordinated use of force and projection of the ability to use force against others. And we were successful in that case. That has launched various other anti-extremism measures that we've taken as an institute within Georgetown Law, but it's also allowed me to draw upon my prior experience for almost 25 years at the Department of Justice, 20 years as a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia, and then 3 years as Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General, and later the Acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Department of Justice. While in that role, the biggest threat, terrorist threat in the homeland, was from ISIS, because it was the time period 2014 to 2017 that ISIS had declared the caliphate. But as even toward the end of my time in the Justice Department, we were seeing that the threat of domestic extremism, particularly white supremacist extremism, was really eclipsing that of the international terrorist threat. And since then, since leaving the department, I think we've seen that more and more and more. So that's a little bit about me. Paul, can you tell the students and the others who are listening to us a little bit about you?
I'm a law professor at Georgetown and a former federal prosecutor. I worked with the United States Department of Justice, and my specialty was public corruption. My work as a law professor, scholar, and activist has focused on race and the criminal legal process. My most recent book is called Chokehold: Policing Black Men. So, Mary, I've worked on racial justice. Your practice experience is focused on national security. We have a lot to talk about.
We do. Let's start us off, though, given this moment in time. I mean, there's no shortage of things we can discuss when it comes to race, extremism, and accountability. But tomorrow at noon, Donald Trump's presidency ends. And that's just 2 weeks after his supporters stormed the US Capitol. Just yesterday, of course, we celebrated Martin Luther King Day in this country. And I just am wondering, from your perspective, given this moment of time, what part of Dr. King's legacy really feels the most urgent or the most relevant to you right now?
Yesterday was Martin Luther King Day, but you couldn't go to the King Monument because the National Mall is closed. The Lincoln Memorial, where King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech, is shut down for the week because of white supremacists who achieved what their earlier Confederates could not, the planting of the Confederate flag in our nation's capital. And so I'm thinking of two parts of King's legacy: the Montgomery bus boycott that made him famous and was the beginning of his successful fight against Jim Crow. Now we have one more wretched day of an overtly racist white supremacist president who described African nations as shithole countries, who told 4 congresswomen of color to go back to where they came from, who called Mexican immigrants rapists and thugs, and who calls the coronavirus the Chinese virus. And so unfortunately, raw bigotry and violent anti-Blackness still exist in the highest corridors of power in this country. The other part of King's legacy is from the end of his life, where after he helped to end formal American apartheid, he started to focus on anti-Blackness in the North. And he looked at systems that seemed colorblind, but entrenched a racial order with Black people and Native people on the bottom. Poverty, segregated housing, disparities in healthcare. This was the fight that King didn't win, but he died trying. In fact, he was murdered trying. So today we know that Black people are hospitalized for COVID-19 at 4 times the rate of white people. There are more Black people in the criminal legal process today than there were slaves in 1850. And today, most Black children are raised by an African-American woman who does not live with her partner. Her average net worth is $100. So I wish King's Poor People's Campaign had come into fruition. His work on what he called the radical reconstruction remains vital and unfinished. So Mary, we like to brag that our school is the best located law school in the country. And we say that because you can walk from our campus to the Supreme Court and to the Capitol. Today, that means that in the military encampment that DC has been since the insurrection, the law school is literally in the green zone. So 4 years ago, tomorrow, Trump's inaugural address talked about carnage in America. We saw that carnage 2 weeks ago in the insurrection, and now we have tanks on the streets. Mary, is this a peaceful transfer of power? Talk about how we ended up here.
Yes, thank you. It's a great question. I mean, I don't think I'd ever thought I would see the U.S. Capitol quite the fortress that it is right now. That's something I've been talking to a lot of international human rights observers who have done most of their work internationally in fledgling or failing democracies who are used to seeing this kind of thing, but have now been turning their attention and their efforts and their professional work toward the United States because of the threats we've seen here over the last 4 years that culminated 2 weeks ago. So I think that this has been building up. I mean, certainly I hope that tomorrow will be peaceful, even though we are prepared. Our law enforcement is preparing for the worst. But certainly 2 weeks ago, that was an effort to undermine democracy, prevent the peaceful transition of power by preventing the electoral count to take place that would certify Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as the president and vice president. And I think we've seen this, something like this coming, especially those of us who've been monitoring extremist groups for some time. I mean, even before the 2016 election, Trump as the candidate was espousing an anti-other platform, a drain the swamp mantra, referring to those who were, career government officials, including attorneys, as well as political appointees, the deep state. He has continued that mantra throughout his presidency. When I was in the U.S. Department of Justice throughout the campaign, we saw a dramatic increase in hate crimes and hate-related incidents starting in the campaign and then escalating after the election, with people feeling very free to express things publicly that they had been only expressing privately before that. And they felt free to do that because they felt like they had an ally in the White House. And that has only increased, I think, through the last 4 years. And that's not just speculation based on what happened 2 weeks ago. It really is demonstrated through what we've seen. So if you think back early on in the presidency, with things like calling the migrant caravan coming to our southwest border, an invasion of the border, and referencing people who are fleeing oppression and violence and torture in their own countries, calling them rapists and murderers and terrorists. This was another galvanizing force for the far right extremists to coalesce in their ideology with the president. And in fact, we saw some unlawful far-right militias actually deployed to the border. And in some cases at the border of New Mexico and Mexico, forcefully captured and detained migrants crossing the border and held them for the Customs and Border Patrol without any authority to do this whatsoever. We continued to see, as the president would make comments about, like as you indicated, Paul, people from shithole countries, and about race relations in the United States, and about the various threats to the United States, comments that were completely unmoored in any type of facts. We saw, again, extremist groups feel emboldened by his words and feel like they had an ally at the White House. Everyone remembers the comments after Charlottesville that the president made, that there were very fine people on both sides. That was immediately merchandised and monetized by far-right groups who used it to recruit and to grow. This year, I think, is a dramatic example of what we've seen, beginning with the pandemic and governors trying to get control of the spread of COVID-19 in their states by issuing stay-at-home orders and masking orders and other public safety measures under their emergency authorities. Trump immediately aligned with the far right, which was objecting to those types of measures. And you may famously recall him tweeting, "Liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota, liberate Virginia, and save your great Second Amendment rights." This is a dog whistle to the far right to take physical action, similar to the action we saw 2 weeks ago at the Capitol. Liberate means to liberate from an oppressing, occupying force. And we saw armed assaults on the State House in Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, Kentucky, Idaho, and elsewhere in this call and response between the president and far-right groups. This summer, after George Floyd was so viciously and mercilessly murdered in Minneapolis, we saw the president immediately responding to racial justice demonstrations by blaming the left and Antifa for single acts of violence or destruction of property that were occurring among almost entirely peaceful protests. And the response of the extremists was, we've got to take it upon ourselves to protect property from these violent anarchists on the left. And we saw deployments across the country, small towns and large cities, of, again, unlawful, heavily armed, far-right militias intimidating peaceful protesters, including like high school Black Lives Matter organizers that are trying to have a march in their town to bring attention to racial justice issues and to police brutality issues. And we saw that deployment. So it is no surprise that, in the drumbeat of lies about the election that started even before the election and then doubled down after the election, lies that he had won the election, that it was being stolen, that he had won in a landslide, that the people were angry, they wouldn't tolerate it, they should never concede, they should fight like hell. Come to DC, it's not a wonder that they marched down Pennsylvania Avenue and violently tried to, violently did overthrow the Capitol Police and violently enter the Capitol and delay significantly the vote. That brings me to a question I have for you, Paul, which is that, you've written extensively about race and policing and police brutality. And I'm just wondering, as I reflect on the summer's events, some of which I was just referencing with respect to racial justice demonstrations across the country, do you see that as another one of these sort of galvanizing forces for extremists that might have even, pushed them further toward the kind of thing that we saw 2 weeks ago in Washington? What role do you think the racial justice demonstrations played this summer in sort of not just the polarizing of the country, but fueling extremists, if any?
I think throughout American history, anytime African Americans stand up for our rights, there's a white backlash. And so any response to this national reckoning on race, any violent response is consistent with violent responses to when African Americans have sought the right to vote, when we've sought equal justice under the law from our police officers and equal protection of the law from our criminal legal process. Whatever African Americans do to enforce the Constitution, to, as Martin Luther King said, all we want is what you wrote on paper. Whenever we ask for what was written in the Constitution to be applied, the response is white resistance, white backlash, white violence. And so, Mary, you're absolutely right. What happened on January 6th was not only not a surprise, it was predictable. And so we know that the insurrection was not a failure of intelligence. The day before, my mom called to warn me not to go downtown on January 6th. My mom is not a law enforcement professional. She's a retired elementary school teacher who lives in Las Vegas. But she knew that just a few days before January 6th, Trump supporters protesting the valid, lawful results of the election. Those supporters had wilded out in the streets of the District of Columbia, roaming around town, inciting violence, and desecrating Black churches. The local officials in the District of Columbia knew. The mayor and the police chief on January 6th ordered every single metropolitan police officer, the officers under the command of the mayor and the police chief, on duty. All vacation day time off was canceled. So if law enforcement knew, why didn't federal law enforcement officers, and specifically the Capitol Police, why didn't they act like they knew? And here we can think of either a shocking kind of negligence or a dangerous, willful complicity on the part of some actors. And the negligence has to do with what Mary alluded to, with the way that we perceive threats differently, depending on the race of the people who are allegedly threatening. And what the response to the insurrectionists, who were mainly white, reminded me of is work that's done in the criminal legal space on implicit bias. And I think everybody knows from implicit bias studies that if the police suddenly see me and they see this, there's something about my skin that makes this look more like a gun, or kind of like a gun, more than it might be a cell phone. And that makes them more likely to kill me, to use deadly force, to extinguish the threat. What a lot of people may not realize is that that same kind of bias, if it's a white person who's actually holding a gun, it makes the police slower to recognize that gun than if it were a Black person holding the gun. And that short delay sometimes can be at great cost to the officer's own safety. And so now it's a commonplace. I was pleased to see President-elect Biden acknowledge that if hundreds of activists in the movement for Black Lives were marching towards the Capitol, that law enforcement would be deep and heavy up in there, and that anybody who breached the Capitol would be under the jail if they were lucky enough to survive. And that clearly didn't happen. But again, the negligence is discounting white supremacy. The recklessness is insufficiently weighing and understanding the history of white violence in this country. And it should be sufficient, the cost of that white violence to African American people, to Native American, Asian American, and Latinx people. That should be enough to make us do everything in our power to stop it. But it's clearly not enough. On Wednesday, 2 weeks ago, we also learned that the cost of discounting white violence can be to our democracy, can be to the lives of our police officers and our elected officials. And we also, unfortunately, have to think about complicity, not some grand conspiracy by the Capitol Police Department or other actors, but we have to wonder, we have to ask the questions, and we have to investigate individual actors, from the President of the United States on down to Congress people. Some Congress folks have worried about whether other Congress people led these insurrectionists the day before on reconnaissance missions, how these insurrectionists knew where to go. And sadly, that kind of complicity is also part of our history. During these incarnations of white violence, when people of color have been attacked for asserting our humanity, police officers and some military officers have always been complicit. And so the question is, if they knew, why didn't they act like they knew? Mary, why not?
Well, I think you've already, illustrated some of the reasons, but to just go a little bit further on that, I know they were aware of the intelligence, and we all know that now because we've seen that the Congress's own, the Capitol Police's own head of intelligence and analysis had written a 12-page memo specifying in pretty great detail the threat picture, including the possibility of an attempt to occupy the Capitol. And so, I think there are a number of possible options, and you've identified, I think, the most significant for the total lack of preparation. As I told a reporter this weekend, it could be that the Capitol Police and the Sergeant at Arms and others that were responsible did not find that intelligence credible. But I think more likely, they did exactly what you've suggested. They discounted the possibility that a group of mostly white people, mostly conservative, would actually use violence, knowing that inside the Capitol were other conservatives voting, and some of whom were planning to actually challenge the electoral slates from states like Arizona, Pennsylvania, and some of the others. And I think there was, and I think the implicit bias that you've identified and explained had to be a part of that. Um, and that this notion that these people just won't be violent. They just won't try to overrun the Capitol Police. They just won't try to take over the Capitol, had to have some role. Now, we know now from public reporting that some of the people who made the decision not to have a more hardened police presence thought that people like Speaker Pelosi and other leaders within Congress would not like the looks, the optics was the word, of the National Guard at the Capitol. And I understand that notion that that's a bad optic, as we all now think the fortress that DC has become is a bad optic. It's a bad optic for our nation. It's a bad optic for the world. And it's certainly a bad optic and inconvenient for anyone living and working in the near area around that fortress. But sometimes, first of all, that decision should have been made at a higher level and not based on an assumption that the speaker and others would not want to call in the National Guard. But more importantly, I mean, public safety was important here, and you at least had to be prepared if the soft policing approach didn't work. And that's something I actually want to talk about a little bit, because if I have any concern at all about accountability for police here, separate from accountability for the insurrectionists themselves and those who incited it, which I think is important, but we should talk more about as well. I do think part of the initial decision to be in, plain, not in riot gear and use bicycle-sized barricades instead of big fences may have come from the very important and righteous backlash against heavy-handed police techniques this summer against peaceful demonstrators in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. I mean, we all watched in horror as federal officers in riot gear launched tear gas and chemical irritants and flash grenades and rubber bullets against peaceful protesters in Lafayette Square this summer in order to clear the area so President Trump could have a photo op in front of St. John's Church. And that was, universally denounced. I say universally, it was widely denounced. And I think, helped to spur a discussion about disparities in policing, which already was ongoing, of course, but particularly disparities in policing of First Amendment activity, and the need to use soft policing. The problem, of course, is that part of, if what was in part behind the decision of the Capitol Police to start with that soft policing was this notion of a response to the very, again, righteous outcry against hard policing, they still needed to have a backup plan, particularly in the face of the intelligence, because the intelligence indicated this was not going to be a peaceful First Amendment protected demonstration. And in fact, it was really only moments before it switched from anything that was entitled to First Amendment protection into a violent mob committing crimes which are not First Amendment protected. And so
it does make you think about complicity, about, again, how could they have been so stupid?
And I think that that's why these investigations that have been launched by the inspectors general are important. I would also think potentially a commission that's not just inspectors general to review this is also probably called for in this moment. We do know that there were incidents of great heroics among the Capitol Police and Metropolitan Police who came to help them as backup. It was a Metropolitan Police officer that was crushed in the door. We saw video of that. And I understand from former Chief Chuck Ramsey, a former DC police chief, that door, in fact, was never breached. But we also saw video and photographs of Capitol Police taking selfies with the insurrectionists, really, inviting them in. I read one reporting of one officer saying, "This is your house now." Even if he said that out of fear, and I don't know that he did, that's obviously an entirely inappropriate conversation. So I think we saw both, heroic performances and really despicable functions of the Capitol Police on that day. And complicity and an investigation into complicity is important. That leads to the next question that goes beyond what happened, I think, at the Capitol into the complicity of law enforcement and even military and former military in promoting extremism and extremist violence as part of this general uptick in what we're seeing in terms of domestic political violence in the US. This is something that I have been trying to keep an eye on for some time, and I'm sure you have as well, but I don't think everyone, the general public probably has recognized the extent of it until they've now been seeing how many of the people now being charged with crimes related to the storming of the Capitol were either active duty law enforcement, including, at some high levels within their local police departments, active duty military, former military. This is a pervasive problem, and it extends well beyond the Capitol. It extends to the communities where these individuals are engaged in policing. And what I've seen over the last several years is that in some communities where they have problems with unlawful armed militias that can be extremely intimidating and coercive against people who are supporting efforts toward racial justice, they're supporting, efforts to prevent the spread of the pandemic, et cetera, that these groups have been flourishing, and oftentimes they're allowed to flourish, even though they're unlawful in every state, because the local law enforcement is aligned ideologically with them and supports them. So I ask you, Paul, to further elaborate on that, if you will, how do we ferret that out of our police and our military, so that we can, not only as a preventive mechanism, but also we're never going to be able to address some of the deep-rooted, racial inequities that we've seen in policing and so many other, areas of interest, education, jobs, financial, et cetera, if we can't, get at the root of these types of problems. How do we do that going forward? How does the new administration approach this?
I'm thinking of lessons learned from the movement for Black Lives. When we started talking about the legacy of Martin Luther King, now it's the movement that has brought us this important, crucial national reckoning on race. The New York Times described the movement for Black Lives as the most successful social justice movement in the history of the United States. We can think about this tragedy that happened on January 6th, and we can think about June 6th, 2020, a tragic moment again for our country, trying to process the meaning of the murder of George Floyd, but also a hopeful day, because on June 6th, there were protests in 550 different cities all over the United States. Black, brown, Asian American, Native people all coming together with white folks to demand change and to resist the kinds of forces that had resulted in that cop's knee on the neck of George Floyd. And the moment that's related to this transition of movements from the civil rights movement led by King to this new movement for Black Lives, it is intentional. So sometimes people say, well, there's no leader like King for this new movement. And that's intentional. The concern of the 3 women of color who started the movement for Black Lives is that previous racial justice struggles had always been led by men, Black men, heterosexual Black men, charismatic heterosexual Black men. And the concerns there are a lot of people who are able and great leaders who are not charismatic heterosexual African-American men. The other concern was that when those movements faltered in the past, it was because that leader had gone away. He was killed, discredited, or moved on to other things, but unfortunately that meant the movement was left behind. And so folks in the movement, they say we're not leader-less, we're leader-full. Everybody's a leader. And again, you can't argue with success. And so one of the lessons is to think about both reform and transformation. So I think the Biden administration will focus on police reforms, including some that are in the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And they range from common sense, like prohibiting police officers from using deadly force unless it's a last resort. It's common sense, it ought to be the law, but it's not now. Two, requiring police officers and people who work in law enforcement to be instructed on our country's history of white supremacy, our country's history of their work, police work, coming from slave patrols, with the hope that that kind of training will make a difference. And when we've been on the case at Georgetown Law School, in our project that we have with the Metropolitan Police Department here, we've been providing that kind of training to rookie cops in DC for the last couple of years, we think with great success. And so I'm hoping that everybody will be held accountable, including police departments. And Mary, when we think about accountability for what happened on January 6th, here I'm thinking about two different groups. One is the folks who participated in the riot, and the other is the folks who didn't, but who support Donald Trump. And so for folks who were on the scene that day, we can think about three different groups with different levels of culpability. First, the people who organized and led the insurrection. The second group are the people who caused violence, who killed that Capitol police officer by hitting him with a fire extinguisher. The people who terrorized the police officers, including uttering racial slurs at the officers of color. The people who trample one of the victims, one of the 5 victims of that massacre. And then the third group are people who might not have been leaders, who might not have killed or beat up anybody, but who were there, who illegally occupied the Capitol to stop the democratic process. And then that second group are the people who supported Trump. And I can't tell you how vulnerable it makes me feel as an African American to know that 58% of white folks voted for Trump for re-election, that they knew about the Mexican rapists, the go back to where you come from, the shithole countries, and that I think on election day, somewhere around 200,000 Americans had lost their lives in part due to the negligence of the president, and that most white people wanted 4 more years. And so when we think about accountability, I think we have to think about accountability for both those groups, for the people who put in action the call from President Trump to stop the votes from being counted. And we have to think about the folks who might not ever have reached the Capitol, but who supported this white supremacist, this anti-Black, anti-Latinx, anti-Asian American, and anti-Native American president. So, Mary, what does accountability look like to you going forward?
So I think that's a really good breakdown of who was physically here, and also a very difficult question when it comes to accountability for those who didn't themselves participate in the violence. I would add another group for accountability, which are those who incited it, never dirtied their hands by engaging in it, but had built up the movement of lies and disinformation on the internet that was the basis, that was the justification for those who engaged in the acts of violence. So accountability for people who in positions of privilege and power with the veneer of credibility, like the president, like some of the members of Congress who bought into the president's lies, like Rudy Giuliani and some of the other lawyers who espoused those lies, promoted those lies, and used similar insightful language to the president about, I think Rudy Giuliani said, trial by combat that morning of January 6th, along with the president saying, fight like hell, never give up, you have to stop the steal. So that kind of accountability, there's many different ways it can take place. Not criminal is just one possibility, but that's another group. But to get back to your question, accountability for those who maybe, who voted for Trump, almost 75 million people. And like you said, 58% of the white population. Why, right? Why? How could that be? And I'm not just talking about partisan politics, right? There are people who are conservatives, there are people who are liberals, and they disagree on policies. But I don't think President Trump was a Republican. He wasn't a Democrat. He was his own party unto himself. And the people that bought into that, I think there's a lot of explanations, and probably people far smarter than me, sociologists and psychologists would be better at examining this. But I think that we cannot discount the impact of the lies and disinformation on these people. Just yesterday, I heard new data from a research organization whose name I've now forgotten, which has analyzed disinformation over social media since the deplatforming of Donald Trump the day after the insurrection. And disinformation, and for those that, that means lies and misstatements, is down 73%. That is a shocking statistic. By getting Trump off of Twitter, frankly, we have fewer lies circulating on social media. And this organization was able to conclusively say that President Trump was responsible for really more disinformation about practically everything, including the pandemic, than any other person on the planet. And this doesn't answer necessarily the white supremacy question, but I think we can't discount Trump's constant use of Twitter to make, support white supremacist ideology in all of the forms you just illustrated so eloquently, to support anti-other in every possible way, to blame all, problems in this country, whether it's jobs, education, the pandemic, violence, on either people from other countries, people of color, or or leftists, violent anarchist leftists. No introspection into what responsibility we all who live here play in, moving forward with things like education, jobs, financial institutions, housing, racial justice in all of those and across all of those in our criminal legal system. So I think that I wonder how influenced some of that 75 million people were by actually, being almost brainwashed into some of this ideology. And I have hope that some can be pulled back from the brink, but I think it's a big, big challenge, because right now we're in a very much of an us versus them place. And that's a challenge for the incoming administration. Further on accountability. Yeah. Go ahead, Paul.
No, I was going to say we're out of time. So just in terms of accountability, why don't we end there with thinking about what that looks like? And I'd love to hear from you more specifically about what accountability for President Trump looks like. I'd also like to push back against your disavowal of partisan politics, that it's not a Democratic or a Republican thing, that it's a Trump thing. So where I'd agree with you is it's not necessarily a liberal versus conservative thing, but I think it's very much a Republican thing that has to be owned. Trump isn't the first anti-Black white supremacist president of either party, but he certainly continues a tradition that's recently been invoked by Ronald Reagan, among others, people, Republicans who've campaigned and won elections based on this idea of limiting or containing the threat from people of color. And in fact, the Republicans supported Trump for all 4 years of his white supremacist regime. And so I think that they have to take accountability. And that brings me to the last point that I'll make, this moment where people seem far apart, and this idea that maybe Biden can bring us back together. But for those people who supported Trump, including, again, most white people, I don't think there's reconciliation without accountability either. I think that they have to acknowledge the havoc, the white supremacist and patriarchal havoc of the last 4 years, really of the last centuries of our history, and to understand the need not just for reform, but for transformation. The Civil War, we learned, if we didn't already know, it ain't over. And what we need now is what Martin Luther King described as a radical reconstruction. This is just one more assault to our democracy. I don't know how many more we could take. Well, what gives me some hope, though, is the 44% plus the people who have fought to make this nation great. The 44% are the white folks who did vote for Biden, who voted to reject white supremacy in the Oval Office, and who joined with people of color. Every group that I could get data on, African Americans, Latinx people, Asian Americans, voted in a majority for Donald Trump. And so this group of a critical mass of white folks and African Americans, Latinx people, Asian Americans, and Native Americans, they give me hope that maybe we can evolve into a multiracial, multicultural democracy. That's always been our dream, but it's never been realized. So Mary, if you could take us out and also tell us about our coming attractions. This isn't the last time that we're going to be focused on the insurrection at our law school.
Yeah, absolutely. And you make a very good point, and I would agree with you that Republicans have adopted, too many Republicans have adopted, at least those elected officials have adopted Trump's ideology throughout this last 4 years. I mean, there are others, like we saw with the Lincoln Project and some other prominent Republicans who denounced his white supremacist ideology and his policies throughout the 4 years. But among the elected officials, it's been disappointing is not anywhere near a strong enough word. And I think we've seen some of that disappointment even in the last 2 weeks, where we immediately saw, pretty much universal denunciation for the violence. And now we're starting to see, well, maybe impeachment isn't the right thing. It's going to drive a further wedge. And that's a cop-out, and it's not acceptable. And to not impeach this president, and I know he's been impeached, to not convict for his actions as related to January 6th. For the Senate not to do that, I think is just really unconscionable. It just doesn't take, if you just take a look at what Politico published, a compilation of videos taken from Parler from that morning of January 6th through the insurrection, and just play that for the Senate, that alone should be enough, frankly, for a vote to convict. And you and I were both prosecutors, so they don't actually even have a beyond the reasonable doubt standard, and it's plenty for them. So, as you indicated, for a deeper dive on how our law enforcement handled the threats on January 6th, as well as on Inauguration Day, which is tomorrow, please join our colleagues Christy Lopez and Vita Johnson this Thursday at 11 a.m. They will hold a live conversation like the conversation we've just had on lessons on policing after the Capitol siege. I'm so grateful, Paul, to have the chance to have shared the stage, if you will, with you for this event. And I hope we can continue these discussions going forward, and look forward to seeing you and the book that you're going to be working on right now.
Great. It's been a pleasure doing this with you, Mary. Keep up the good work, and thank you everyone for tuning in.